So what about the shellfish? When I'm on campus, when you're on campus, people will come up and say, you Christians, you just cherry pick verses. In the Old Testament, it forbids eating shellfish. It forbids eating bacon, for that matter. You can't wear clothes of two kinds of fabric, and also forbids like two men having sex. So you guys just pick one of those, and you say, well, we're going to obey this one, and we're not going to obey that one.
Yeah.
So how do you respond to that?
I think the response is severalfold. First of all, I would say internal to the scriptures itself is maybe, for lack of a better word, we'll say the fulfillment. Because so if we take Matthew 5:17, so we want to take the Bible as a whole. And I would say many Christians probably are cherry pickers, and they don't know what to do with these verses. And so they do read a verse in Leviticus like, yeah, no homosexuality. And then what do we do with shellfish? And even the Christian themselves, and they just want to say, oh, well, that's Israel. Well, why isn't the homosexuality Israel type of thing? So what we need is a kind of a proper hermeneutic of how we approach the law, the prophets, the scriptures. And so in Matthew 5:17 is kind of a governing idea for me, is Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. And so there are aspects of fulfillment that would change the nature of our relationship to God and these sorts of things. And so, in the Old Testament, they had a tabernacle system, they had the law and Moses, and then Jesus kind of comes along and identifies as the tabernacle. So I do want to say that there's aspects of changes that have taken place with the coming of the new covenant and what Christ has established. But I think also one of the central things we need to do as Christians, and I would say Christians have not traditionally done this well, is we need a proper hermeneutic of how we're approaching Leviticus and our relationship to Leviticus. And that needs to be related to what happened at the fall. And so part of the reason we want to be good creationists isn't just because we don't like Charles Darwin, but we want a rich theology of creation. We want a rich theology of what happened at the fall. And we don't want these things just so we can be antithetical to a culture, but so that we can positively reconstruct, here's what's going on in the world. So take Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and trying to make this as simple as possible. Is a serpent comes along, deceives her, she eats, then she hands it to Adam, he eats, and then God brings judgment upon the serpent, upon the woman, and upon the man. And if you were to take those and kind of give those pegs, kind of in many ways for the rest of the Bible, so what God says is, I'll put enmity to the serpent, he says, I'll put enmity between your seed and the seed of the woman, you will bruise his head, or you will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. And then, so what we see throughout the Old Testament is oftentimes women being involved in crushing the serpent's head. So Jael, she crushed the serpent's head. And then he tells the woman, you're going to increase in pains in childbirth. And then with the man, he says, from the sweat of your brow, you'll eat from the ground. Now, if we take that judgment upon the serpent, woman, man, he's crawling on the belly in the dust of his earth. The woman's pain increases in childbirth, so there's something going on in childbirth, and you have the man and the sweat coming out of his pores. So if we were to jump forward to Leviticus 11, which is where kind of some of the, it's also discussed in Deuteronomy, but we'll just stick with Leviticus. Leviticus 11 deals with the food laws, what are clean and unclean animals. And at the end of Leviticus, I believe it's 11:42, it talks about the things in the dust of the earth. And so that language there in Leviticus 11 is the language tied in to the judgment of the serpent being in the dust of the earth. And so for the Israelite, it's not that that God's creation of a pig is an abomination or somehow inferior type of thing, but given the context of the fall and the dust of the ground being dirty or being cursed, I would argue that there's an aspect that our plates reflect the nature of reality. And so for the Israelite, their plate and what they're eating reflected the nature of reality. And so that's why Leviticus 11, I would say, corresponds with the judgment on the serpent. Then if you go to Leviticus 12, it talks about women being unclean after childbirth, which I would say corresponds with the judgment upon Eve after that. And then Leviticus, I believe it's 13:14, deals with stuff coming out of men's pores, and they have to go to the priest and see if they're clean or not. And I would say that corresponds with the judgment upon Adam. And so what we have going on in Leviticus 11, 12, 13, 14 is actually set in the context of the fall. And now, as Christians, we don't think women are still unclean after childbirth. We don't think men have to go to the priest to have their pores examined, what's coming out of them. And then also similarly, the aspect of the food of what our plates are saying. And I would say that is because the last Adam has took the crown of thorns upon himself, took upon in his flesh, and he's making all things clean. So he's kind of reversing what the first Adam did in the judgment. So those aspects that would make Israel distinct from the nations, now that the nations are coming in I would say those aspects have been fulfilled, and that distinction of separating Israel apart from the rest of the world, those barriers have been broken down or fulfilled. And so the food thing was related to the old covenant in light of the fall. Now that Christ has come and overcome the fall, I would say there's an aspect where, yeah, it's been fulfilled, so these things are no longer binding. And maybe like a way to look at it a little bit is when we were growing up, oftentimes our parents give us curfews. They tell us what we're going to eat. They tell us what we're going to wear, how we're going to cut our hair, all these sorts of things. And so when you're in immaturity, you have a lot of rules that govern you and tell you what to eat. Make sure you're getting a well-balanced meal. Hopefully, if you're a college student or beyond, your mom's not checking in. She might still say, "Are you eating okay?" You know what I mean? She might want to make sure you're eating okay. But if she's still checking your plate and saying you need a 10 o'clock curfew, it's actually a sign you're very immature. And people who are immature end up in prison. You know what I mean? They get more rules because you haven't gone on the maturity. So there's an aspect of the Old Testament law. They do have a lot of laws because they're under immaturity. But now that the Spirit has come, there's an aspect of maturity. So how does that relate to other laws, such as homosexuality, or the whole list? I believe it's in Leviticus 18, dealing with all sexual norms. You know what I mean? It's not just homosexuality, it's bestiality, it's incest, father, daughter, even I think maybe one removed aunt type of thing. So you have a myriad of laws there. So why would these hold, and why aren't these part of that fulfillment aspect? And so what I would want to root sexuality in is actually even creation. And so so you have things that are especially there after the fall. So even right after Noah's flood, God institutes the death penalty. So there's a context where the death penalty comes in. It wasn't there before the fall because there's no context for a death penalty. And so prior to the fall, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So I'd say even prior to the fall, you had sexual norms. You leave your father and mother, you cleave to your wife. So there's no incest going on there, you know what I mean? Because you're leaving them to cleave to your wife. And if you're cleaving to your wife, you're not pursuing other women. You're not pursuing the beasts of the field that came before him. Nor is it a homosexual relationship, you know what I mean? And so what you do have, I would want to argue, is that you do have things in the Old Testament law related to creation, the Old Testament law, even in the New Testament, that kind of transcend the particulars. So even kind of here in the United States, just because your parents gave you a curfew growing up and they told you not to kill doesn't mean, oh, well, now that you're old, you can go ahead and kill. So there are other things that transcend the particulars of the administration of what's going on in your life and where you're at in maturity. So Yahweh is life, therefore murders, the shedding of innocent blood is wrong. Yahweh is truth, therefore lying is wrong. So these things still hold as the covenant progresses or matures, but some of the particular administrations of the covenant have been fulfilled, or in a sense, I don't know if set aside is the best word, but have kind of, since it's been fulfilled, it's no longer binding on the life of the Christian. And so things like circumcision in the Old Testament has been fulfilled with the coming of the Messiah, and that's why you can circumcise if you want, but there's no spiritual significance to circumcision. And if anything, if you think there is spiritual significance, you're actually sinning. You know what I mean? So there are actually things, if we seek to have people obey things in the Old Testament, we're actually sinning against God because they've been fulfilled. So if you want to offer bulls and goats every morning, you're actually sinning because those things pointed towards Christ. So a proper hermeneutic as Christians, we can see where all these things are related to fulfilled in Christ, and it doesn't become an arbitrary cherry-picking thing. And what's interesting is there was a big debate in the early church of, well, how do these Gentiles now relate to us? Now that they've come in, do they have to be circumcised, and what laws do they need to keep? And so in Acts chapter 15, where they're debating circumcision, one of the things that they basically lay out, they kind of appeal to an aspect of what's going on. I want to say it's Leviticus 17 and 18. And one thing that's kind of interesting is what's reiterated in Acts chapter 15 are the laws from Leviticus 17 and 18. And in Leviticus 17 and 18, what you do have is a particular instruction that says these things are applicable basically to the Israelites, the foreigner and the sojourner amongst you. So the foreigner and sojourner could have had unclean plates. You know what I mean? They could have eaten the unclean foods in the Old Testament. So when the Jews and Gentiles are trying to come together in the early church, the Jews decided, no, let's not put any other burden upon the Gentiles other than these things, which have always been a burden on the Gentiles, which includes the sexual immorality. So I think if you look at the whole picture and you understand the nature of the law, and sure, there has to be some effort to understand the context and things like that, we can see that the Christian's actually not cherry picking, but it's directly related to how we see the nature of fulfillment, what we see the nature of Christ's work, why these laws are given. There's a reason for that God gave these laws, and it's not just God's like, oh yeah, pigs unclean. Oh yeah, mixed fabrics, because even like the mixed fabrics thing often comes up. Well, are these things actually holy? And so like the priest would wear a mixed garment, and they were holy. So and they would even have a mixed tassel on their garments, their little threads in the corner. So even the Israelite would kind of have some of these things. So all this stuff, if we're really honest with the text, so I would object and say, well, it's actually the objection that's cherry picking. You're not really trying to understand our story. You're not really trying to understand our context. You're like atheism 101. You're like, mixed fabrics, shellfish. You know what I mean? And you know it's a bare objection when it's just shellfish. You know, there's no context to why these laws. So if we let's just say there's a riot breaks out here and police implement a curfew at 10 o'clock and anybody on the street will be arrested. Well, it's not a permanent universal. It's a temporary injunction given the circumstances. And so I would say similarly, there are aspects of the Old Testament that are temporary injunctions given the context of the nature of the covenant of how God's relating to them. And now that the Messiah has come and he's overdone what the first Adam has done, those things have been fulfilled. And now that fulfillment has come, it's not that those laws are ever bad, they're just not binding.